We're now going to move on to hear from Chuck Kennicutt, who is a professor emeritus at the Department of Oceanography in Texas A&M University. He previously was on the works on the U.S. Antarctic program, was on the U.S. delegation to the Antarctic Treaty, and is an ex-president of the Scientific Committee on Antarctica Research, and led the first horizon scan for Antarctica in 2014. This time last week, David Attenborough was on this stage launching the opening of the building next door that's named after him. Chuck is nearly as distinguished. He has a point in Antarctica named after him, which Wikipedia tells me is about 17 kilometers north of Cape Washington. And he's going to tell us about what the view's like from that point, what he sees on the horizon, and how that is shaping polar science and policy in the southern continent. Chuck, over to you.
Thank you, Stuart. I think the point is melted, so I'm not sure. I'm still, are you still a point if it's a long story? Anyway, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and particularly Bill Sutherland, who worked with us on the Antarctic Science Horizon Scan. And I thought the charge I had was to talk about what it was that we feel made this horizon scan particularly successful. I'll give a disclaimer, others will judge whether our horizon scan was successful or not. And as you just heard from Bonnie, often because of the time frame of horizon scan, it really takes a number of years to see, is the information that was provided useful and was it adopted. But generally we can see, even at this stage of the publication of the horizon scan, and also how it's being used, that it's been taken up quite widely by the Antarctic community. There were a number of challenges too. As most of you know, Antarctica is very remote, so the questions that are being asked are particularly judged, I think, on the cost of doing science in Antarctica. Also, it's a geographic-based community, so we were looking at everything, I say, from genomics to astrophysics. So essentially, I think we had 10 horizon scans within a single horizon scan. And then it's very diverse, and it's an international audience. We haven't heard too much about how do you deal with very diverse cultures in different countries. In this case, there's 50 countries that have signed or acceded to the Antarctic Treaty, and so it's quite a challenge when you start to look at what are the highest priority scientific questions internationally, because this is also driven by national interests and also their ability to conduct science in Antarctica. And I'll also talk not just about the horizon scan, but the next step, which I think is probably going to have as much impact and be as important, what we call the roadmap challenges. And so I'll try to keep on time. I know we're a little bit short here. But this is what we first started out with. This is the first time this community came together. And you can see what the goal was, to scan the horizon. Bonnie introduced it very nice. I won't say much more about it, the mechanics of how you do a horizon scan. But it really is trying to find what are the highest priority scientific questions. And often there are many, 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 many questions out there. And horizon scanning, I think, is particularly effective in trying to come to a collective view of what are the highest priority science questions going forward. Now, also, as I mentioned, I'll talk about this project, which is the Antarctic Roadmap Challenges project, which was the second step after the horizon scan. Trying, as you can see, the goal is to deliver an implementation requirements report. Now, we've heard in the various presentations today that in order to enable the science, we have to speak to the people that actually have money. Another interesting characteristic of the Antarctic science community is often the scientists are not the ones that control the funds. They're not the ones that make the decisions about access as far as logistics and support, which are very expensive given the remoteness. And so it's a challenge, and I'll come back to this, of what audience you're speaking to. But this particular part of the process was to translate the science into actual requirements. And I'll demonstrate with Antarctic science what those requirements might look like. And I think this is a very important step. Again, policymakers, decision makers, people that actually control funds are usually not the scientists. And so we have to make this link so that they can understand the importance of the types of resources that will be needed if the science is considered to be highest priority and important. This is the outline, and again, what I wanted to do and what Bill asked me to look at was what were the steps that were most important in having an impactful outcome from these types of priority setting exercises. And the take-home message is every step of the way is important to how the outcomes are seen by the community, and I think also whether they have impact or not. All the way from preparation, who you include. There was just a question about how many people are involved. This was particularly a challenge in Antarctica. We had almost 70 people at our workshop. The method of prioritization, again in this case, using horizon scanning. How do you communicate and disseminate the information afterwards? And then I said this important step of translating the science into actually what are the requirements to provide the answers. At the end of the day, as we heard in previous presentations, if people may be interested in the questions, but I think ultimately they're really interested in the answers. And so the question is, how do you communicate what it will take to produce answers? And certainly the context is important. I think I'm preaching to the choir here. I'm not an expert on this, but over the years have been involved in a lot of this, but again, seeing this as a continuum from science to conservation to policy. And they all have an influence on each of the actions, depending on the group, but usually you're talking to very different communities within these various sectors, but again, these are all interrelated, and it's important to understand that context in each step of the way. Now, within the context of Antarctic science, the horizon scan, again, was not done in isolation. We had always had this larger strategy. There's what's called the Antarctic Conservation Strategy, which is proceeding on a separate line. I don't have time to talk about these other important parts, but again, you can see the audiences change depending on where you are in this process. But ultimately, this all combines to have the impact, I think, that's wished for. So the Antarctic Conservation Strategy looks specifically at the threats to Antarctica. And then the Antarctic Environmentalist Portal, and David Walton's here today that's involved in this project, is actually translating the science and the information produced by the science into policy-ready documents. So again, the horizon scan doesn't try to do that. That is then handled by these other projects that are ongoing in parallel. The Antarctic Environments Portal you can find on the web. It exists and has already produced documents. And these documents are fundamentally dependent on the science that's produced, and again, this relates back to the horizon scan. So again, you need to look at these critical linkages and the basic stakeholders, as we've heard. Bonnie mentioned this. It's good to have the end users involved throughout the process, and we had people involved in each of these parallel activities involved in the horizon scan. One of the things I learned about this process is I had not heard about horizon scanning 4 or 5 years ago. And so part of preparation is there's a lot of work. As you saw, Bonnie outlined a number of horizon scans. You'll have in your midst the master of a horizon scanning. And so Bill luckily agreed to join us in this particular horizon scan, and it could not have been done without his insight and guidance. This process is a little bit complex and convoluted, and so this type of preparation beforehand is very important to understand what other people have done, what's best practice, and there's a lot of literature out there. Particularly found this analysis, I think, of 12 to 15 horizon scans are very useful if you're trying to set up your own activity. And in the preparation, we talk about participation. I can't go through all this. We don't have enough time. But we had a steering committee. There was open selection with nominations from the community. There was careful selection of the discussion group leaders. There was training. There were facilitators that were put in the discussion groups. And again, as Bonnie mentioned as well, this making sure about a diverse and representative group of people. I'll talk about some of the other things we did. We had online surveys where people could submit questions that were used as the essential starting material for the actual physical gathering. So there's a lot of existing background documents. We had a website that was set up with all the background. This, again, is openly available to the public. We looked at other horizon scan exercises. We also raised quite a bit of money. I saw it was inexpensive. I guess we spent a lot of money. This cost about $750,000 to do these two projects. I guess in the bigger scheme of things, that's not overly expensive. But fundraising, and again, that's important because all participants' costs were paid. And then finally, we had a very nice site that we went to, and also made sure that there was a lot of opportunity for interactions outside of the formal Horizon Scan events. Inclusion was important. We took a very much community-based approach to this, and so that involved online surveys to compile the baseline questions. We had over 1,000 questions were submitted from the community. As I mentioned, the attendees were nominated by the community and then selected by a committee. Also, all of the documents and outcomes went through internal and external peer review, again, giving people an opportunity to comment. All this goes toward establishing the credibility and authority of the outcomes, and that's really key to having your outcomes being accepted, that the people are credible, that they're seen as the experts. In this case, also that the community had ample time to provide input. And external peer review, you see we published these. I did just want to mention our financial supporters for both of these. And I put this up also to show how broadly the community participated. This was the Horizon Scan financial supporters. I should mention Tinker Foundation. And the Antarctic Roadmap Challenges Project, which I'll come back to. But again, part of acceptance of the outcomes is related to deep involvement of the community involved. So there's a very large number of organizations, as I mentioned, Antarctica being international. You'll see generally, I think the steering committee had members from 15 different countries. The Horizon Scan retreat had attendees from 22 different countries. How prioritization is key. As we heard this morning, I'll come to this, how we presented this. We ended up with 80 questions. I also was aware that you can't roll out the scroll and read 80 scientific questions to policymakers or those that fund. So you'll see how we came up with themes after the questions were agreed. But again, getting toward the credibility, you need an unbiased process. The entire horizon scanning democratic way of going through and selecting the highest priority as part of that process. Collective agreement, a transparent process. Everything was published, is openly available, and also having sufficient time. We did find it a challenge, though, to get people to think beyond their next funding cycle. Scientists are more worried about their next proposal than what's going to happen in 20 years, but future-oriented thinking, making sure that minority opinions, which might often be very important, were preserved. And as I mentioned, if you're dealing with many countries, language and cultural barriers can inhibit discussion. But these were all addressed partly in the format of doing things online. Now, I won't go into these at all, but we had the 80 questions, but they were then summarized into 7 themes. And you can see the big ones: climate change, how the oceans and atmosphere in the polar regions interact with the rest of the planet, sea level rise, also climate, looking at paleoclimate records and looking back into past history, adaptation, vulnerability, and evolution of Antarctic life. And also Antarctica is used to place various types of astrophysical research, both using the ice sheet as a detector, but also looking out into space. And then finally, the growing stresses that are witnessed by Antarctica. We did a lot to communicate. There were publications. You saw in Bonnie's presentation this Nature comment. And I point this out because there are very different audiences, and you need to think about how you present your outcomes. We had our web page. We also, the comment is a 2,000-word, I wouldn't say policy-oriented, but it certainly speaks to a broader audience. The intricate details were published in the Antarctic Science Journal with all involved being co-authors. So how it's presented, and again, both of these were peer-reviewed. So it gives additional credibility to the outcome. The other thing is actually presenting the results. Bill always was surprised every time I emailed him. I think I was in a different country. This is just over the last 2 years since the Horizon Scan. You can see presentations of the outcomes have been made to national programs in a number of countries around the world. And also coming up, the Antarctic Treaty Consultative Meeting, the SCAR Science Lecture will feature both the Horizon Scan and the Roadmap Challenges Project, and also the international SCAR meetings in Malaysia in August. So it's very important, again, to produce outcomes that can be communicated to a very wide audience.
2 minutes, Chuck.
Yep. And so the next step, though, is, as I said, I think most people are interested in the answers as much as they are in the questions. And this is within an Antarctic context, so we very quickly after the scan talked about what would it take to be able to field the research and science that needed to be done to answer these questions. And these were the main challenges we saw, or barriers to realizing the promise of Antarctic science. And again, some of these are very specific about access to the continent in the Southern Ocean, technologies, environmental protection. Also, Antarctic science has traditionally been internationally cooperative in communicating the value of the science. So the roadmap challenges, which I'll go through very quickly, was constructed to be able to address these challenges and translate things into an implementation plan. And the big thing here, again, is from questions of knowledge. So this is talking to the funders and also the logistics support people, which are generally housed in the Antarctic programs. And again, just to give you some idea of the complexity, there's 30 members within the Council of Managers of National Antarctic Programs, and this was the audience for what I like to call the guide. We had a very similar, though this was not a Horizon Scan, this was more traditional based on committees in a workshop, online surveys, and also reporting publications. But these are the types of outputs, and again, I don't have time at all to discuss this, but looking at what were the highest priority technological advances needed to answer the questions identified in the Horizon Scan. And again, this was done through discussions, but also online surveys of the community. And if you're talking to funders, they need to know what's the time frame for these developments, so you can see this looked out at least 6 to 10 years, and trying to look at each of these and what were the highest priorities within the community, and this allows decision makers to talk about actual implementation. We also looked at estimated costs. That's the first thing you'll also be asked, is how much does it cost? And again, going through the various priorities, we at least made, let's say, qualitative estimates of cost. Antarctica access is another important thing. This has to do with where you establish facilities, what type of logistics support is provided to the science. And again, this is oriented toward those that actually address the question. So where I started, I think the impact is very much related to all the various details all along the way. Preparation, who you include, how you prioritize, all gives credibility to the outcomes. And then this communication and translation part of it is also extremely important. And so why do we do these? I think this has, in the Antarctic community, created this framework for partnerships and leveraging assets. It also is in the process of informing policymakers and also national investments, and then building this community through this shared collective view of the future. And I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Chuck, and thanks for compressing your talk. So time for 1 or 2 quick questions. Over here on the left.
Hi, thanks. 2 great presentations. I was just thinking about understanding organizational contexts and thinking about the resource pressures that certainly in the UK we're under in a climate of austerity that's likely to continue for at least the next 5 years and so on, and how you then engage people whose nose might be rather stuck to the grindstone in the immediacy of current issues and struggling to give their attention to the longer term that both you and Bonnie were talking about.
I think if I understood part of the question right, as I mentioned, this trying to push people forward, I noticed even over the period of the workshop that, like say, scientists in particular are worried about the next funding cycle, which is usually the next 3-4 years. And slowly, though, we kept encouraging them to think forward and forward. Our original time frame was 20 years in the future. And to be straight up honest, I don't think we made it. I mean, sea level change, things like this are actually of great current interest. So getting people to think that far in the future, I think, is very difficult. And I don't have the answer of how you do that. The other issue, particularly, I'd say, well, I don't know if it's especially the Antarctic science, but again, what you see is a continuum. There are issues that are relevant today that were talked about 20 years ago, and will probably still be relevant in 20 years from now. Like say, big questions like sea level rise. They'll be on the radar screen for a long time. So you really get this continuum, but you try to push people as forward as possible in their thinking, but it's very hard. You first have to make that assumption of where you're going to be in 20 years and then extrapolate from there. And I think that's difficult. I can't do it.
Last question, Juliet.
Yeah, thanks very much. A question to, well, both speakers perhaps. So I'm Juliet Vickery from the Centre for Conservation Science at the RSPB. So a lot of these horizon scans produce obviously very important issues, but very broad issues. And I just wonder whether there's any guidance when you do these exercises for the kind of scope of the individual questions, if you like. So you often look at them and they're kind of very all-encompassing. And as a researcher, you maybe want to think about what can I do to tackle this. You have to break them down quite a lot more. So how do you decide on how big a question is to be part of that horizon scan?
Yeah, there's actually a couple levels to this. And like I said, we had these 7 clusters, and just to be clear, those clusters were after the questions were decided. We didn't decide sea level was important, and then what are the questions to answer sea level. So there's a level of detail, I think, when we talk to policymakers and decision makers, where the whole concept like a sea level they can understand. If you look at the 80 questions underneath, though, they're much more specific. And the other thing that you find, though, is you cannot really define the details of the experiment. And again, scientists tend toward that, where they say, I want to say, well, you should study penguins on this island in the next 5 years. We purposely avoid that. The peer review, or however science is selected in a country and vetted, will set up the details of the experiment. And so it's really, I don't think it's useful for a broad community to start to decide at that detail. But like I say, if you look at the 80 questions, you'll find them to be much more detailed. So it's subtle, there's different levels of complexity, but ultimately, the scientific community and the researchers are going to define exactly what the outcomes of the experiments needed to do the research to answer the questions. This also happens when you start looking at logistics and technologies and like that. You just can't define down to a level of detail that you need this type of radar deployed on this type of platform in this part of the ocean. That'll really be defined by the researchers, but this gives, I think, policymakers that broad agenda that they can implement.
Great, thanks very much. We're going to have to wrap it up now because we need to open up the doors to let people in for the lecture that follows. But can you join me in thanking again Chuck and Bonnie for the 2 great presentations this afternoon?